Hi, everyone. Welcome to the week 3 lecture. So, hopefully, last week it helped create a picture in your mind of how the movements and the policies of the past shape the current climate, ideology, and personality of the borderland. However, the complication that comes from having an identity tied to the border is that once you leave that border, the identity is no longer accepted. So, for example, a lot of folks in El Paso find comfort in the fact that the Latinx or Chicano or Latino, Latina, however people identify, they're the majority here in El Paso. And that's the case along the border in most borderland areas. However, while it is beneficial and it kind of creates a sense of community, once folks leave the borderland, that kind of rupture of their identity happens at a much more faster pace, right? Because then, even though they have like this dual identity that we've talked about over the last week's readings, most people, the second they leave this borderland, they are identified by others like this prescribed identity of this is who you are based on what I'm looking at, right? So, as we read last week in McField and this week in Chavez, identity is inherently tied to race, and race, with the inherent beliefs attached to it, becomes equated to nation, right? So it's why some folks, I've had conversations in some of my previous classes when we talk about issues of identity and how people identify themselves. We start talking about race and gender and sexuality and citizenship. And I'll typically have like one student who will tell me, well, we're all Americans, so why can't we all just be Americans and identify as that and come together? And I think in theory, you're kind of just off the top of your head. It sounds like a good concept, and it sounds like how many people think we should be as a nation. However, the problem is, like, taking myself for example, there have been plenty of times where I've been outside of El Paso and someone treats me like I'm from Mexico, even though that's not the case. Apologize for that. And so I think that's where kind of that misunderstanding comes, right? Because even though I myself might identify as something, as a particular, whether it's race or gender or any of those things, however I identify is only half the battle, right? Because that's only how much I ascribe myself my own identity. I have no control over how other people might identify themselves. And that becomes even more complicated when we think about all the things you've read about the border and the history of the border. And it's that famous quote from the movie Selena, right? Where oftentimes many people are on the border feel like they are not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, right? They don't know Spanish well enough. They're using Spanglish. They don't know their cultural history all that much. But at the same time, their identity as Americans gets questions just because of their last name, the color of their skin, and a number of other things, right? So it is, for folks living on the border, there is this tightrope you have to walk, right? In terms of your identity and who you're talking to, like this idea of code switching, right? Where you change the way you talk and the words that you use depending on who you're talking to. All of those things really come into play. Even a lot of folks who I know who are transplants on the border, right? Who are not originally from here, but now live here. They have a difficult time understanding this dual identity that a lot of folks have, right? Where I've even had conversations with colleagues and with friends and even family members where even, Mexican Americans who are U.S. citizens here in El Paso oftentimes talk very negatively about folks who live in Juarez and the folks who come into El Paso to shop and to do business. And there is this mentality even amongst Mexican Americans that, yes, I'm Mexican, but I'm not that type of Mexican, right? So for people who are not from El Paso, who are not from the borderland in general, it becomes this really big kind of problem they're having to figure out, because it's like, if you call someone a Mexican, they may take offense to it because they don't associate themselves with Mexico in any way, even though they may be American of Mexican descent. It could be considered offensive to them because they know that they're not that type of Mexican. And others that fully embrace it, even though they may not be from Mexico, and some folks might not even have any family in Mexico, they very much embrace their own Mexican identity. And as we've talked previously before, like last week, a lot of the kind of government policies that have taken place in the past, and even recently, I think even in the most recent census when I was filling it out, my option in terms of race was either white or other, and then it was like a secondary conversation about whether I identified as Mexican American or not, right? So even as in terms of race, I'd be hard pressed to find anybody who would look at me and say that I was white, but that's really one of the only options that I have aside from other. So moving on to the reading, so like in chapter 9, we start learning about the violence that occurs on both sides of the border, right? So we're talking about the gang violence and the murders that are happening in Mexico that are often the reason why a lot of folks are coming into the United States. But then once they come here, they're dealing with two things that we've talked about, right? One, we're talking about the perception of immigrants, the perception of Mexicans, and how that, how they're treated because of those perceptions. But then we're also thinking about the conditions should they end up in custody with ICE or CPD or Border Patrol. So there is a lot to maneuver and a lot to think about in terms of the people who live along the border and some of the battles and struggles that they may be dealing with. Now, oftentimes you'll see it in conversations, whether it's large scale, like macro conversations, or even on the micro level, each country blaming the other for the problems, right? So we have the U.S. who constantly, we've read it, in last week's readings, where there's this continual conversation that immigrants are the problem, and specifically people from Mexico, whether they're talking about caravans or they're talking about invasions, there's this negative connotation about the negative influence that immigrants have. However, on the other hand, our economy is intrinsically tied to immigrants and immigrant labor, and let alone like the taxes that immigrants pay. So there is the blame that goes into Mexico and the fact that they have these immigrants that are coming in and they're the reason why we have these problems. And on the other side, there's a conversation that, well, the reason why we have all this gang violence and the reason why we have all of this stuff going on in Mexico and why our people are now going into the U.S. is that the U.S. and the U.S. Population continues to buy drugs that's fueling the cartels in Mexico, right? So there's this back and forth of figuring out whose fault, who's more at fault. As you move on into Savea's chapter, they get into the issue that is something that as leaders we may need to be aware of more than anything else, and it's this idea of mixed status families. And I think not a lot of conversation goes on in terms of what this means to be a mixed status family, where, in any normal family, right, we have to consider what are our partners, our children, all the lives that they have outside of just being part of like the family unit that we have, right? Where, most people, when they think about their family, are thinking about having to provide for their family. When it comes to mixed status families, right, they're having to juggle day-to-day happenings in a way that a lot of folks that are legal citizens don't have to consider, right? These struggles may be as simple as like forming intimate relationships, love, commitment, public acceptance, material benefits, all of those things from forming a family that, most citizens get just because they are citizens here, that mixed status families don't get. But even like if you consider things like purchasing a home, paying for a wedding, going to college, all of those things start becoming a lot more complicated when you're thinking about the fact that you're living in a mixed status relationship. So this week, in addition to the lecture we just had right now, we're going to have a guest. His name is Mario Carrillo. He is a campaigns manager for America's Voice. He is a legal permanent resident, so he has been through the immigration process, and he is also in a mixed status family. And so I think he'll answer a lot of questions about what that means. If you think of, I know DACA's been a big conversation as of late, given the Supreme Court decision. And so he'll shed some light on the ideas of what it feels like to be an immigrant living on the border, because he's from El Paso. But also now living in 2020, what that may mean living in a mixed status relationship. Because I know even in my own personal conversations with him, I know myself, I feel very educated. Just had the assumption like, okay, well, you're a legal permanent resident and now you're married to your wife who is here through DACA. Shouldn't she now just become a citizen? And that's not the case. And he told me that one of the options that potentially could be on the table was them having to move away and wait 10 years before they can start the process all over again, when they've already, it's essentially the only home either of them have ever known. So I think it'll be really beneficial to understand, to see like a personal story and understand some of the things that we may not consider when it comes to things that we may consider since we're in a leadership position, right? I think if you've taken any of my other classes, and I think I have a lecture scheduled for later on this semester, where I talk about the importance of getting to know your team and the fact that it becomes almost impossible to create that synergy if you don't create an environment where people feel comfortable talking to you, and not just about like day-to-day things, but talking about their family and understanding some of the things that they're having to face outside of work, right? Whether it's a sickness in the family, whether it is, a child is going out to college, whether it's just any kind of small thing that might be going on personally, that has ramifications when it comes to the workplace. It's invariably going to have an effect. And I'm sure we've all dealt with leaders who are like, they don't care. Your job is to get your work done, leave all that stuff at the door. And that might work for some people, but I think we've come to the understanding that given that we spend a lot of time with our coworkers and with our team members, it is critical that we create a family feeling environment to make people feel more welcome, and in turn morale goes up, and in turn production goes up. So part of that is understanding the struggles that other people may have and things that people might have to deal with on a day-to-day basis that might affect their workplace. So that's the lecture for this week. And you can look forward to the interview with Mario Carrillo. I'm hoping to get that uploaded over the next couple of days, but you can just keep checking on Blackboard for that.